Okay, so I'm just going to briefly talk you through a number of these different extracts that come out of the lesson that we were looking at on symbolism in the text and the mangrove symbol particularly. We'd looked in quite a bit of depth at the non-hierarchical effect of mortality in the text and the way that it is a component of that overall mangrove symbol of the non-hierarchical rhizomatic structure of the root network, which functions symbolically to represent Condé's sort of ideal vision of society in Guadeloupean identity and Creole identity. If there are passages from this that you haven't yet looked at, most of them are on the recent screencast I made today with Maria in class. So if you're looking back at those, it's worth checking out the screencast towards the end as we look through the extract of Dodo's Pelagia and Desino. Now, we're going to jump forward and take a look at another subcomponent of the symbol, the interconnection that is evident in the novel. There's not lots of different extracts where this is the case, but we see it most directly in these opening parts of Dusk on page 7 and 12, and then Moise's testimony on page 16 and 18. So let's take a look at the first one in the Dusk section. This extract in the middle, seeing such a crowd, you might have concluded that they were being hypocritical, for all of them, at one time or another, had called Francis a vagabond of the cur, and isn't the fate of the cur to die amid general indifference. Now, you've got this third-person narrator reflecting on the crowd gathering at Francis Sanchez's wake, and identifying the fact that there is a sense of hypocrisy in the way that they seem to be arranging themselves. And even though they see themselves individually as being arranged very hierarchically and as isolated individuals in this community, there's a sense of universalism about this here. All of them, at one time or another, had called him a vagabond and a cur. So there is a universal connection here by virtue of their hostility towards Sancho. And so that interconnectedness is by virtue of their hostility to an outsider. So what is universal is that hostility. So that interconnectedness and universality is suggested in this brief little reflection on the gathering individuals. We jump forward to page 12. And look at this description of Xanthippe. When did they notice the presence of Xanthippe huddled up in the corner of the veranda, motionless, silent, eyes glowing like cinders under a cooking pot? How long had he been there? When had he arrived? No one could say. It was just like him to slip in unnoticed. Like when he settled in on the edge of Riviero's cell. So we've got this little passage here that actually suggests Xanthippe's assimilation in spite of hostility. So in spite of the fact that the community are extraordinarily hostile to him, he has found a way of assimilating into this shared gathering and finding a part to play in this society, even though it's heavily excluded and marginalized one. So we've got another connection there, another suggestion of this interconnection and assimilation going on. There's further examples in Moise's testimony here. First one being on page 16. They started to avoid the place, and they're talking here about the house, the Alexis house. A voice had silently screamed insults and threats to their eyes. They started to avoid the place. It was then that 3 Haitian field workers who had found jobs at the nurseries but were probably unaware of all the rumours and scares that were starting to pile up in ominous clouds broke down the front door of the house and spread out their bedding of rags on the dining room floor. When 3 days had gone by and they still hadn't shown up for work, Lulu sent an overseer to box their ears. He found them stiff in their rags, their black tongues hanging out between their teeth. They had great difficulty in finding a grave digger to bury them, as well as a priest to recite the De Profundis. So what you see here is this suggestion of not deliberately cultivated, but almost accidental interconnection between these excluded individuals, the Haitian field workers, and the place itself. They find themselves, like Francis Sancho, dead in their rags, and by virtue of that death, they take part in the place. They become part of Riviera Ocel, even though they're treated with great hostility by the locals. So this is a kind of physical assimilation into almost the sort of substance and the fabric of this particular society. As you flip the page, extract on page 18 describing the friendship between Wise and Francis Sancho. People began to find the friendship between Wise and this Francis Sancho, who sprang from God knows where, a bit strange. The first evening the two men stepped into Chez Christian for a shot of rum. The locals felt like shoving them out. However, since Francis's shoulders were as wide as a carpenter's bench and they merely whispered slyly behind his back, some of them said among themselves they would teach Wise a lesson. Then they remembered that his family had always been slightly cracked. Sanson, the father who had pretended to leave for Dominica to fight with the Free French forces like all the boys of his generation, had, in fact, taken another direction and mooned away his time on another island while his parents lamented him, dead or missing. Once the war was over, he had returned with Sean, a Chinese woman who up to her death had never really known how to speak properly to her neighbours. Valère, the elder brother, had left to work in the oil fields in Venezuela and was never heard of again. So, in this passage here, you've got this sense of profound hostility towards Wise and the locals, but then this gradual suggestion of difference, hybridity, heterogeneity that's being created through the friendship between Wise and Francis Sancho, as it identifies here, he who sprang from God knows where. And then we find that Wise himself has elements of this God knows where about him. That his father had pretended to leave, and then his wife, Sean, a Chinese woman, has integrated in, perhaps not effectively, but integrated into Guadeloupean society. There's an element there of the gradual assimilation of difference, even if it's reluctant and hostile, within Francis Sancho and Wise's friendship and within Wise's own identity. There is this suggestion of heterogeneity and assimilation of difference and the creation of hybridized identities. That, obviously, in terms of the mangrove symbol, is the interconnected nature of its root work. The interconnected nature of its roots, which are actually rhizomatic in structure. So that racial equivalent to the interconnection of the rhizomatic root structure of this mangrove symbol. Then we have these endings and beginnings to the vignettes themselves, which are quite powerful formal embodiments of this interconnection. And we see this actually, first of all, at the end of Wise's testimony on page 30. A very simple articulation of this interconnection. He bent his head very low and mingled his voice with the choir of others. So here, they're singing this kind of Christian psalm as a kind of hymn at the funeral. And so there's an assimilation into Francophone culture here taking place through this singing. But there's a mingling of Wise's voice in with all of these other participants in the ceremony. And that mingling of his voice, I think, is a fairly strong figurative embodiment of the principle of assimilation and interconnection. But we see that taking place at the end of this vignette. Then we also see this at the end of Sonny's, on page 93. Sonny, one of the most maligned and hostilely treated individuals. It says, deafened by the noise of the rain, the men had drawn their chairs up close and were laughing heads together, leaning up against a column, oblivious to all the noise. Lulu Lemon was staring into space. So we have this segue here from one of the most maligned and marginalized to probably the most powerful, which picks up immediately with his vignette. The Queen of England, Elizabeth II, is sitting with her crown of diamonds planted squarely on her head. And so the structure of these narratives, the way they end and pick up and show these interconnections between each other, is a formal embodiment of that rhizomatic root network, that in spite of Sonny's malign status and his marginalization, his narrative kind of bleeds and blends with Lululemon's. And so each of those individual vignettes has its own kind of integrity, but relies upon its interconnection to the next one in order to make full sense. We see that again at the end of Lulu's on page 103. Lulu looked around for a chair and with a frown got the unfortunate Sonny to give up his seat. Sonny had calmed down and was sighing in rhythm to get to the chanting of the women. For everything its season and for every activity under heaven its time, a time to be born and a time to die. He took a glass from the hands of Mademoiselle Leocadie Timothée, who had got up and was shakily serving drinks, while her old head nodded gently from her great age and her mouth murmured in prayer. So there's this suggestion of a kind of, almost like a kind of baton hand over here from one character to the next. But in the same way that Sonny's ends with Lulu, Lulu's vignette ends with Sonny. And focuses again on another character. But each of these interconnections at the beginnings and endings of these vignettes joins up each of these discrete narrative acts and turns them into an interconnected, hybridized form of storytelling. And so on the level of narrative form, the story is embodying that aspect of interconnection that mirrors the mangrove's rhizomatic root network. Now, the most direct parts of this symbol are the hostility, what we call spiking yourself on the roots and being suffocated by the brackish mud. What we see as the consequence of the dangers of the interconnections of this society, the spikiness of the mangrove underneath the surface. So what we're talking about here really is kind of community hostility. How hostile these people are to each other. And we see this a great deal in a number of different extracts, but here are a couple of the most distinctive. Wow, on page 28. These are a mixture of characters from various positions in this social hierarchy. This is after Moise has discovered, Sancho has discovered Moise looking through his trunk, which is actually well-intentioned, but is mistaken for simple kind of materialism and greed. He says, you think I'm after your money, but if it was money I wanted, I would have gone on boxing. I would have become featherweight champion. Dudu Robinson said I had the makings of one. Money's nothing to me. I was looking to find out who you were in order to protect you. Do you understand what I'm saying? Those were sad days. The rain never stopped. The ravine Vilaine overflowed its banks, swelled, and in a flow of blackish silt that lived up to the bodies of animals it had caught off guard in the savannas. A terrible stench rose up, and in order to drive it away, enormous quantities of incense were burnt in the shrines built into the hillsides. Now, here what we see is this kind of collapsing of this relationship into hostility and mutual suspicion, which is the default kind of setting of the community, that they don't trust each other. And so we have this failure of understanding between Sancho and Moise. There's a failure of understanding, which is another kind of failure of Moise to cross the mangrove. And it's partly because of the climate of hostility, the prickliness of the society he finds himself in, and the fact that they've treated Sancho with such hostility, that Sancho himself is so suspicious of Moise. So that climate of interpersonal hostility is the legacy of the past, but it is responsible for that flip side of the mangrove symbol. For all its democratic, non-hierarchical structure, there is a spiky danger about the way the community interacts with each other here. You see this also from Mama Sanson at page 62. She asked about Francis Sancho. What could they have against Sancho, who had a heart of gold? There were those who couldn't stand the din his dogs made when they scoured the night, sinking their fangs into soft, defenseless flesh. There were those who couldn't stand to see him sit and drink rum in the wind on his veranda while they themselves sweated it out under the good Lord's hot sun. And then there were those who had never forgiven him for taking Mira, whom they'd lusted after for years. The women were the worst. They hated Mira like salt hates water. To tell the truth, they were jealous of her and unrelenting. So we have this varied kind of multifaceted hostility as she describes the different components of the community. There were those who couldn't stand to see him relax. There were then those who had never forgiven him for taking Mira, and the women were the worst because they hated Mira themselves. So we have this absolutely bilious, kind of vile interpersonal hostility that Mama Sanson reveals here through her description of what the community is like. So we see again that kind of the spiky roots of the mangrove network. The interconnectedness of the society obviously brings about this sense of connection that all the characters are unaware of. But what they are aware of is their alienation from each other and their hostility. We see this also in Sunny's testimony on page 92. The narrator is describing the moment that he sees Sancha with Mira, and Mira has bullied Sunny. There she was, proudly glowing with her light skin that made others ashamed of the colour of theirs, glowing with her dazzling shock of hair, glowing with her scent of forbidden fruit. If anyone had laughed at, martyred, and hounded Sunny with her spitefulness, it was Mira. When she stopped in front of the church with her parents for the weekly gossip, her prying alley cat eyes would burn him with contempt. Once, when she had met him on the hill at Dillon, she had picked up a stick to threaten him with, although he was only looking at her. Who had transplanted this poisonous machineel onto his shores? Get out of here, she had already started to bark. And this is a great tragedy for Sunny, because he sees Francis Sancha as a friend. But then that possibility of friendship and that possibility of recovery is ruined by the fact that he himself is attracted and having a sort of sexual relationship with Mira. So the possibility of Sunny's interconnection with Sancha being a positive thing is ruined by Sunny's violent interconnection with Mira and then Mira's sexual interconnection with Sancha. And so that whole triad of different relationships there is destroyed through the spikiness of their interactions with each other. Importantly, we see this in Mira and Dina as possibilities of antidotes, or what we call crossings, recoveries from this hostility. Mira's on page 43. She describes Sancha. Now that I know the end of the story, my story, and I ended up like T-Marie being eaten alive, I can't understand why I placed all my hopes in this man who I didn't know from Adam. Probably because he came from elsewhere, from over there, from the other side of the water. He wasn't born on our island of malice that has been left to the hurricanes and the ravages caused by the spitefulness in the hearts of black folks. So she identifies here that his outsiderly status is what provokes this reconceptualization and rethinking of how she should see herself and identify herself. But also the fact that his outsider status means that he's born outside of this malice that has been left to the hurricanes and ravages caused by the spitefulness in the hearts of black folks. There's a direct articulation there of that spiky quality of the mangrove that Vilma articulates in her testimony. But here it's in the service of Mira rethinking how she approaches this situation. We also see this in Dina, another one of Sancha's romantic interests. Well, her romantic interest in him, she says, at that very moment he turned towards me and his eyes plunged into mine as if he were reading my thoughts. She's describing seeing Sancha for the first time. I wanted to hurry on by, but I was nailed to the spot in front of the hedge of Rayo. He greeted me. His face was of a rich roasted corn colour. His eyes held the promise of long journeys. His mouth that of never-ending kisses. After so many years, I had ended up forgetting that I was a woman, and I was frightened of the desires that were flaring up inside of me. So what she sees in him is this potential for escape, this potential for rethinking her identity and rethinking herself in response to his actually exotic, kind of handsome strangeness here. And so both Mira and Dina have this outward-looking reaction to him that is an antidote to all of that insular hostility that you see in the extract of Moise and Mama Sanson and Sunny, the way that the community is violently hostile to each other because of its interconnections. Well, here are the two characters that seem to use it as the impetus to look outside of itself, to look outside of the mangrove, and to rethink about themselves in a way that allows them to cross this deeply hostile sense of interconnection that is the final component of this symbolism.